2669, Private Kurt, J., within Celian Theater. After entering the auditorium, or rather, the largest briefing room he had ever seen, and took a seat with his squad. Among the countless others, the area was filled with more than just rookies. There were plenty who donned white markings on their armor, with an even smaller subset having donned red stripes upon their armor. All companies were then separated into their respective sections, with Cobra taking up most of the rear, with Raven and Viper taking up the sides. Across from him, he saw another group of raiders that were shallow in numbers compared to either Viper or Raven, but held the most blood stripes of any company present. It was Raptor Company. There wasn't a fresh-bodied rookie present, confirming the earlier notion by Sergeant Auclair that they couldn't take any more new joins. And their presence was staggering, with there being only 3 squads and no other platoons. It was an earlier, he could tell that they were a storied and experienced bunch, as noted by the matted sheen of their chest plate, and the countless scars upon their armor. He could tell that no matter how much they cleaned, it would still look like it was still covered in dirt and grime, which added to their veteran status, unlike the other companies who only wore their battle dress uniform, himself included. In the center of the room, a large, waist-high hollow table was situated, and an image of the current system was displayed. In the top corner of the edge of the hologram, the name of the system was displayed, revealing it to be called Cella System. The 3 officers from before had then presented themselves, with all called to attention by Sergeant Auclair, whose voice reverberated greatly within the large room. "At ease," returned the Major. "Now let's begin." All others had returned to their seats in preparation for the briefing, leaving the room ultimately quiet. As you should all be well aware, we are less than 12 hours before commencing with our invasion. You should all know what our enemy looks like and the types of weapons they employ. He changed the image to a series of weapons that looked similar to their own, at least in material, but their design was foreign still with a hint of familiarity. Like us, they still employ ballistics, but have begun transitioning to plasma, with at least 1 or 2 soldiers wielding the new tech. Your armor may be rated for heat, but we still don't have the metrics yet against direct plasma shots, although earlier reports indicate you should be able to tank a bolt or 2, as long as it hits center plate. Now, here is where everyone will drop. Major Raikou then turned the image to a rough top-down layout of a city's center with several icons placed in several locations. With a star centered over a building, it indicated that was their target. To the northwest, in an area that looked like a park, the letters VIPR were encircled, with lines leading from it to indicate their route to the objective. To the northeast and east, the letters C Beret and Raven were placed respectively, with arrows leading down to the target. We're still too far for proper scans, so enemy movement is still unknown, so expect heavily contested grounds. Any questions? There was a silence in the air, as no one either had a question or simply didn't want to be the center of attention. However, a hand was shot up. It was Moran, now allocated to Raven Company. "Good evening, sir. Lance Corporal Moran. What are the rules of engagement, sir?" he said after rising from his seat and placing himself at parade rest. The reply, however, was pleasant for many. "If they wear armor, they're dead. If they so much as hold a stick, you waste them. There should be no civilian contacts, so it's open season on the bastards. Now get some rest, with your gear on. To be a raider means to be ready at all times when in the field. From now on, you will sleep, eat, and shit with your gear donned at all times. Am I clear?" he finished, to which the soldiers before him replied in unison. "Aye, sir," they sounded, reverberating throughout the hulls of the ship. They were then dismissed soon after, leaving them just around 10 hours of rest. As they were instructed, all were donned in their armor as they slept, with there being a skeleton crew of raiders on watch. Some had slept with their helmets on, while others slept with it off. He remembered doing this during some of their field exercises, but that was when they had the earth below them. Now they did so in furnished beds and comfort, which did the opposite. As a result, he woke up throughout the night, with himself waking up 5 hours before reveille. Amidst the red lighting, the berthing remained quiet, as the creaks of the ship rang out in a low hum during his traversal of his new home. As he walked about the absent corridors, he would come across a long hall with display screens beyond the hull of the ship, revealing the wealth of asteroids that surrounded them. Small bursts of lights flashed in the distance, leading him to solidify that he was in a war zone and that the Stellar Navy was currently in combat with the enemy. Within sight, just enough for him to make it out, the carriers that led them into battle were seen, albeit separated by several hundred kilometers, with small lights constantly leaving and returning. No doubt that fellow pilots were busy with their sphere of combat, to which he almost yearned for it. While he was absorbed in the sights before him, he heard muffled steps behind him, but by the time he turned around, a pair of fingers formed into a gun were placed in the front of his visor. The person behind them was familiar, with jagged teeth of the original purple visor on the edges of the helmet, with similarly colored eyes in the center. He looked down just below their neck. "Eau Claire, you really should turn on your helmet's sound enhancement. Otherwise you'd be dead." She lowered her finger gun and rested against the wall with the displays to her back. It was a function he knew well of, but liked the muffled quietness he experienced with the empty halls. He turned it on, revealing more than a simple hum of the ship, and sounds further down the corridor were more noticeable now. He turned to her in an attempt to converse with an experienced raider. "Sergeant, if I may, but where's the rest of Raptor Company? I noticed during the briefing that you had only 3 squads worth." She turned to him from previously viewing the distant battlefield before her. "Aboard the ships currently tearing those alien bastards a new one. We do more than just land invasions, you know." He nodded, recalling the earlier simulation of a ship's interior, so he was familiar with their boarding action doctrine. "With the Marines, right? But what's the point if the goal is to destroy the enemy?" he asked, to which she replied with a shrug, but did so to not dismiss his genuine inquiry. "Let me tell you how Raptors like to fight," she started. "Command wants high-ranking officers, so what do? Board them when they're under fire, kill whoever gets in our way, take the VIPs and scuttle the ship," she said nonchalantly. Jay was appalled, but ensured to keep his body language minimal, but he understood why, that they needed to be ruthless in the face of the enemy. "Isn't that a war crime?" he said, with slight worry of the possible repercussions. "Ha!" she scoffed. "War crime punishments only apply to those under the TRSC, not to alien scum who decided out of fear to invade and massacre fellow Terrans. As far as I'm concerned, they have it easy. If it were me, I'd string every Cellian who stepped into our space. But it's not my decision." "I suppose, Sergeant," he said softly, to which she removed herself from the railing and towards the direction of the hangar. "Just keep in mind, rookie, the enemy won't hesitate, and neither should you," she said with a wave before rounding a corner, and her footsteps disappearing quickly before the hallway returned to its silent ambience. Across from him, the small bursts of lights had simmered before ultimately returning to its silent and natural state. With that, small dashes of lights began returning en masse to the 2 carriers, along with their escorts of frigates, corvettes, and cruisers. The battle seemed to be won as he noticed his ship began to orient towards the large group, with their silhouettes growing ever larger until they were basically within effective cannon range. An alarm then rang throughout the ship, waking it like a hive of hornets, with raiders erupting forth from their berthing, armor donned as a voice was sounded through worn speakers. "This is the Tau all raiders. Proceed to your designated drop hangars. I repeat," before he could go to his bed for the rest of his squad until they met him in the corridor. "Jay," said Cam as he fastened his helmet to his neck seal. "You ready? I think we still have 6 hours before the timeline." "Then we best head out," replied Jay as the group navigated with the rest of the raiders. The area they had entered was simplistic, being a large rectangle room with benches and weapon racks lining the walls and a centrally placed holographic table in the center. Each room was then separated to allow for a platoon's worth of individuals, and instead of a visual of their target, it was a list of names separated first into a platoon of Alpha, Bravo, or Charlie, then into 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th squads, respectively. That's how you get your designation, by falling into those groups and then adding your palace in the squad. And this is how they found out, with Jay's identifier labeled as Zebra Charlie 411. "Sweet! We're in the same squad!" commented Cameron. His designation was similar, with his designation as Seabura C412, with Fields as Seabura C413, and Spears as Seabura C410, and also designated as their fire team leader. "Nice going, team lead!" Fields sounded with a pat on the back of Spears, before the person in red stripes before them spoke. It was the sergeant from the transport vessel that also trained them for half a year, Sergeant Faith. "All right, listen up. You have your designations, so sear it into your mind. As long as you are part of this company, then these will be your call signs. If you so much as hear a whisper over comms with your tags, you answer and obey. Understood?" He then turned to the man in gold beside him, Major Raiku. "Do you have anything for them?" To which Raiku answered, "Not much. You all should have memorized our path and our target, but keep your comms open for orders. If you follow your training, then everything will come to you with ease. Now, we still have some time before our drop, so stand by and get set for a combat drop." He then departed, with those in the same platoon finding seats around the staging room. On the wall, a countdown was made visible for the approximate time of their supposed drop, which added to his feeling of anxiousness. To find ease, he looked for his squad, who were seen standing beside the holographic display table. It was rugged and simple, built for utility rather than looks. He saw Cam working with the menu panel that was situated with a slant that matched the degree of the edges of the table, changing the view to an image of the fleet. Several identifiers were present, but, to save space, they were severely condensed for simplicity. "To think we're invading with a fleet this old," voiced Cam as he selected one of the numerous ships, bringing up a still image of the frame that added basic information, such as name, class, tonnage, and weapon systems. One such ship he selected was one of the two main carriers that led this invasion in the first place, the TRSC Sword of Reckoning. "You know, it said that ship served during the Solomon Advance," voiced Jay from behind, catching them off guard. "That would make it damn near 400 years old. There's no way a ship that old would be equipped with a current slip drive and not blow up in the process," voiced Spears, denying the claim, but Jay pressed on to demonstrate his knowledge. "It's true. It was first commissioned in 2219, and it was one of several carriers to lead a counter-assault against the Solomon Advance some 60 years later. But from the looks of it, it's been retrofitted heavily. To think it's been in service this long," explained Jay. They continued surfing through the several carriers and even exposed fighters, while Jay gave some knowledge tips on some of the most notable. Normally, you can differ the types of frigates by the colored stripe, with some instances varying by class entirely. Look here. The destroyers... He then began to explain their differences in detail, but started off first with their main identifier, their colored strip that ran down the sides of their bows. Destroyers were painted with red, and frigates were colored yellow, green, and blue in parallel to their tonnage, from light, medium, then to heavy, just as they saw on Mars in low orbit of their recruit depot. "I'm surprised you know that much," said Spears. "You like ships that much?" Jay shook his head to the comment. "You forget, I used to be a data runner for the scum of the universe, so we had to get familiar. Luckily, I didn't have to tango with stellar fighters. Otherwise, I might be dust," he said with a laugh. As they continued, the timer continued its synchronized count, while they continued to navigate through the various menus the display table had to offer, within limits. Their search ranged from weapons systems to armor components and even vehicles, as they continued to get familiar with known technology they would be bound to use. To say it was a wealth of knowledge was an understatement, and before they knew it, significant time had elapsed. As they continued, the lights lowered slightly as red strobes flashed on corners of the room. Then, a call over the intercom sounded. "This is the Teo all combat ready raiders. Proceed to your drop pods. I repeat," said the voice as the ship rocked from an explosion just beyond their hull. And before they could sort out the explosion, a voice came through their helmets' communication. "All raiders, this is Cobra actual to battalion. Get in your pods and get ready to drop. You've got less than 15 minutes. The call cut, leaving their room busy and chaotic. The walls were assaulted for their weapons, and the appropriate ammo was taken. Seeing this, Jay and company did the same. Jay grabbed one of the few available Badger rifles, paired with an unsuppressed sidearm. Cam did the same, with Fields and Spears both opting for the main auto rifle, the Series 8 and unsuppressed sidearms. They were all fitted with enough ammo that one could reasonably carry by placing them in extra pockets and pouches. Knives were placed in the lower part of their back, where a machined insert was created for their armor. With themselves ready and loaded with ammo and food, they set off for their pods. The way the staging room was situated, it was placed in the lower portion of the ship and ran along the center line of the ship's frame. Entrances to the rest of the ship usually entered from the forwardmost or rearmost sections of the staging areas. To the left, a series of 4 doors was made with a small but thick window that peered into the hall that held their pods, 13 in total. To the right of the room, it led to a series of hangars that held landing craft, such as the Odin, or something of a similar role. Spears was first to lead the squad into the leftmost door, with the number 4 above it, knowing inherently it was reserved for their squad, and speculated that this was the same with every drop hangar. As they entered, they were met with exposed drop pods, with their doors propped open waiting for its occupant to enter. At the end of the walkway, a Sergeant Faith stood as the raider in front of them situated themselves into the pod, while Faith checked to see if it had sealed correctly. Still, the red lights flashed before turning yellow, signifying a new timeline. 5 minutes! Rookies! Get in your pods now! He yelled as he pointed to their nearest pods, each labeled at the top that matched their spot in the squad. Jay entered his pod with ease, along with the rest of his fire team. He then felt around in his dimly lit pod as the door slowly closed with a hiss, sealing him in. He would see from his polarized windows Sergeant Faith making a final check of the pod's seal before moving on to the next. He then placed his rifle into the pod's internal weapon rack with a click, and he wrapped his hands around the manual controls. As they were, he couldn't move them even if he wanted to, since they also acted as stability support until they hit terminal velocity. Until then, they would hold them until they needed to make an in-flight correction. Once Faith was done checking the last pod, he returned to his own just as the flashing lights had turned green and the intercom sounded. "This is the TAO. Launch all pods and execute your mission. I repeat." As the voice said, the floor below the pods opened, revealing a dark scene that Jay could barely make out. He didn't have to do much because the entire system was automated, and he was just in for the ride. As he tried to get a bearing on the situation below, one of his larger screens popped up with a face, with the nameplate just within view. It was Faith. "All right, you all will listen to my orders, got it? I don't need any of you playing hero, so don't go off unless you have your team with you. Team leads, get me a count," ordered Faith. As he said, the designated fire team leaders spoke into their pod's comms with affirmation that all were present. He figured this was due to the other 3 smaller screens on the left of his pod that had the frontal view of Spears, Fields, and Cameron. "Let's rock and roll, Raiders. Remember, stick with your teams and rendezvous ASAP. I'm setting each of you your team's designated zone. Clear it and then meet with the main force. No need to be afraid about being quiet. They already know we're here," he said with a nonchalant tone. "It's a good time to earn your stripes, rookies." As he said, the pod sounded a miniature countdown before he felt his stomach rise from the sudden drop. But instead of seeing with clear skies and vibrant colors, it was dark and cloudy, with only the tracers of gunfire dancing in the distance and into the air. As they continued to fall, Faith began to brief them again. "Remember, our main mission is to raise hell for the enemy, so do whatever you can to get their attention. And don't worry about ammo. We'll get it once we can secure a zone for a safe resupply drop." Jay figured he mentioned this to keep them in the mindset that they could let loose without regard for standard law. At least that was what he speculated. As they continued to fall, and broke through a small layer of clouds, he saw it. A mass of tall silhouettes plagued the ground below, with smoke and fire rising from below. With it, alarms blared in the form of a monotone female voice. "Missile, missile, launch flares." He did as fast as he could, slamming a big red button labeled Countermeasures IREM, as saw the result, not just from his own pod, but from others in his vicinity. It was an elaborate mass of sunlight that illuminated the ground below and continued as they fell to the earth below. A mix of flares and reflective material were scattered in the skies as explosions rocked the outside of his pod, as he was sure it did for the others. At first, he feared that maybe one of the missiles had hit one of his friends, but seeing their continued existence on the inside of his pod alleviated that worry, and he focused on bracing for the inevitable impact. With a single drogue chute slowing their descent down to terminal, they were now in free fall. With an indicator above the countermeasure button, it told him how many were left of each, revealing he still had enough to counter several more missiles if needed. But with a flick of a switch, he set it to periodic, aiming to keep as much of a missile lock off himself for the rest of the way down, notifying the same tactic to his fire team, to which they agreed. "Woohoo! Let's get it, baby!" Fields yelled with fervor. Sergeant Faith maintained radio silence, but found that the pod shared a function that only fire team members could speak freely, suggesting that Fields used that before blurting out in a rush of adrenaline. "I've got the coordinates. Follow my ping. It should be up for you guys as well," sounded Spears. Jay looked below his pod and noticed a marker with a distance count above it. He didn't notice it until now, but it was useful. "It won't last long since we're nowhere close, but it'll give you guys an idea. Let me sync drop control so we can land together," proposed Spears, to which they all agreed. To Jay, they were already over the target, so he didn't really find a need to lend controls, but did so anyway to avoid meaningless conflict. Over the course of their drop, they would continue to receive missile warnings, but were easily alleviated with a collective use of their flares. Once their retro boosters kicked on, signifying that they were about to hit the deck, Jay then slung his rifle across his chest with the barrel facing toward the door in a readied posture. He continued to brace for the rest of the way, until he felt the hardened sensation of the seated suppressing the kinetic forces of gravity. But it became erratic as he was thrown around violently from a sudden crash. He then fell back into his seat, holding on to the controls, finding them stiff. He continued to be thrown until his eyes grew heavy, and before he knew it, he had blacked out,